Classic Homer Simpson, am I right?
Why would you choose that clip, Chris?
Because that clip in particular brought me back to an episode that we did with, I believe, Spoiler Piece Theater about whatever happened to Baby Jane.
Oh, yeah, I could definitely see that.
Karen Black's delivery is just so, like, I mean, I feel like her delivery specifically in that scene, not to even mention the numerous other scenes in that film, The Day of the Locust from 1975 by John Schlesinger, that we'll get into in more detail later, all have to do so much with this kind of push and pull in camp cinema. But the way she says that, the way she like kind of vibrates her voice in this very kind of old Hollywood style, with melodrama and flair, and juxtaposed with Donald Sutherland's, meek version of Homer Simpson, it brought me back to Bette Davis, and
it is some sort of camp, which we will determine in this episode. Welcome to Film Trace. This is a podcast where we trace the life of a film from production, conception to production, all the way to release and reception. We are in the 1970s in our series on camp. We have two films today, the Rocky Horror Picture Show from 1975, and also The Day of the Locust, also from 1975. We do have a special guest. Go ahead, Chris. Did you say something?
I was just going woo for our special guest.
Oh, woo indeed. For Marisa Hayes. Marisa, can you introduce yourself? I found you via looking for an expert on the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and I found the book that you edited on it, Fan Phenomenon, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, which came out, I think, in 2015, right?
That's right.
Tell us about that and tell us about yourself.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on the show. I'm delighted to be here. So I am a film and performing arts writer, obviously with a deep love for the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So I'm so happy that we're discussing that today alongside Day of the Locust. I've been a fan of Rocky Horror Picture Show since I was a teen. So one could say that I came of age with the film. I'm also a second generation Rocky Horror fan because my parents attended screenings of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. So in 2015, I had the great pleasure of editing an anthology of essays based on different aspects of the Rocky Horror Picture Show, but particularly focusing on its lasting impact among fans and those who participate in screenings. And since then, I've continued to love the show. I haven't had much occasion to write about it recently, so I'm really happy a few years onward now to be discussing the film with you.
That's awesome. We really appreciate you being on the show and having a true expert of the film. And the reason I chose that is because I think, Chris, you'd never seen it before, right?
This was my first watch.
Same with me. So,
oh my God. Should we apologize, Marisa?
Yeah.
No need to apologize, but that's actually really interesting. And in the Rocky Horror fan lingo, we would say we have a virgin in our midst.
That's what my wife told me, yeah.
Yeah. But I feel like we haven't fully experienced yet because we both haven't seen it in a midnight showing. So I feel like we're still pre-virgin, essentially.
Oh, that's true. I mean, you're going to get marked with a V in lipstick on your forehead the first time you go. That's part of the initiation.
Can't wait.
Yeah. That's what I'm looking forward to. So normally what we do when we talk about a film like this is like, what's our history with it? We don't have a lot of history with the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Right.
So
I would definitely want to hear from Marisa first as our guest. But then my big question for you, Dan, and you can ask the same of me, is why have we not seen it until now? Because I think there's a little bit to unpack there. Perhaps too.
Mine's really simple. Very intimidated by it. Intimidated by the entire experience, the culture surrounding it. It was one of those things where I feel like I wasn't in the right group of people. Mm-hmm. Like I feel like back to we grew up together in Wisconsin, and it was a pretty conservative area, and so there just wasn't a lot of people that were necessarily into this movie or going to midnight showings that I knew. And sort of by the time I was like 25, 30, it was like, oh, I kind of felt like it had passed me or something. Mm-hmm. But I will say this, like seeing this movie now in like my early 40s, I was like, I wish I would have seen it when I was like 15 or 16.
Same.
absolutely would have changed my life.
Fantastic.
And it is, it's really interesting to sort of be like, oh, it's this really big thing that's out there that I don't understand. So I was like, I kind of was scared off by it, I think.
Oh, well, I'm sorry you guys missed the occasion to see it when you were younger, but I think it's really interesting that you came to it first as a film and not during one of the live participatory screenings, because that's a totally different experience. And as much as I love it, and as much as it is this like truly exceptional phenomenon in film going, I think that sometimes it tends to overshadow the actual contribution of the film itself. Like, we don't talk much about the filmmaking or what's so fantastic about the craft behind the film. So I think in a way it's great that you guys got a chance to really see the film, quietly at home first before you went into the chaos of an interactive shadowcast screening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And for me in particular, I was also intimidated, but having kind of, I hope she wouldn't take offense to this. I don't think she would. My wife's a musical nerd. And so she was very surprised to learn that I hadn't seen it, even though we'd been married for over a decade. And there was this kind of, and I feel like this is true of a lot of other kind of classic movie musicals. I hadn't seen, for instance, like Umbrellas of Cherbourg until a couple of years ago. I hadn't seen a lot of. I hadn't seen the 2005 Chicago, which had come out like when I was like in my depths of like seeing everything, until like a decade ago. So I think that there is this kind of phenomenon, both with Rocky Horror in particular, but also with movie musicals writ large, that just like feels, I think, especially, for, whatever case, like male presenting, like cis straight guys, where there is this element that feels kind of like an othered world. And I've loved getting deep into it, and it's amazing like how accessible it is if you just like give it a shot. And I think that, coupled with the fact that like there is so much like sexual politics in the film, whether it's kind of more obvious or not, I'm so curious to learn about what exactly made this movie play so well for such a huge audience, that it like ran for 7 years nonstop and then continued to run intermittently all the way through today. So this I think more than most episodes is going to be a learning experience for me. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, Marisa. Like, who was the original audience for this film, and how did it grow and grow and grow and become this intimidating phenomenon?
Right. Well, I love what you said about, the counterculture aspect and the queer culture aspect that often is associated with this film and is one of the major elements underlying it. It initially began as a stage show. Richard O'Brien, who sings and plays Riff Raff in the film version, is the creator. This is his monster, his Frankenstein, and it really is a Frankenstein, which I think we'll probably get into later with all of its film tributes. But initially, it really was seen as this alternative piece of theater. It played at a really small theater in London that seated only about 60. So you can imagine what the crowds were like initially. But, this is also the time of glam rock. It's a time when punk is slowly beginning to take shape. And you've got a lot of really interesting alternative theater, like the work of Lindsay Kemp, who would go on to choreograph for David Bowie and Kate Bush, and indeed the makeup artist who worked on the film and who designed some of the iconic looks, including Frankenfurter's eye makeup, is someone who also did the makeup for Mick Jagger and David Bowie. You've got the costume designer who had already worked with Tim Curry on a really alternative theater production of Jean Genet's The Maids. So it's really a time of very interesting experimental genre-busting theater with a lot of queer aesthetics that are coming into play, especially with gender identity and gender representation. So I think that initially the stage show very much appealed to this kind of avant-garde crowd that you would find in popular culture in London. And stage shows were also pretty popular in New York and Los Angeles, and would go on to be staged in San Francisco as well. And the stage show emerged in 1973, which I think indicates its popularity when you think that only a year later they're shooting a film version of it, right?
Yeah.
They're coming up soon on the 50th anniversary of the film next year because it was released in 1975. And then I think you start to see that it also equally appeals the film to certain alternative crowds. The mythology of the film goes that initially it flopped upon its major, theatrical release, didn't do well. But a year later, it was rebranded in the United States as a midnight movie. And it's in 1976 at the Waverly Theater in New York that suddenly the audience started talking back to the film. They were going to these campy midnight movies. John Waters' Pink Flamingos had already, started to gather a cult following. And so people started to interact with the film. And that's how the film really took off in the United States, where it started to do really well on the midnight movie circuit. But to answer your question in terms of who this film appeals to, what's interesting is that I think over time, the film took on this cult following. It spread first via word of mouth, now today, of course, via the internet. And I think that it's a much more widely appealing film now. It's probably lost a lot of its transgressive qualities today as we've, progressed in terms of gender, sexual orientation, and gender representation rights. But it's still very much a playful, inclusive film that's important to a lot of people who are now spreading it down to the next generations. You've got whole families who attend Rocky Horror screenings these days.
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. I think that every time I think about the way we've progressed as a society in regards to the LGBTQ plus community, I also get bogged down by all the work that still needs to be done,
right?
And to see Rocky Horror here in this nearly 50-year-old really celebratory kind of depiction and representation, and just element of so like I said before, it's so that's what grabbed me, is I knew the songs would be catchy, but I didn't realize how much they would just immediately rouse me and stick with me. And I think everything you said, particularly about glam rock and the punk movement, because that seems to be more the element that Dan and I kind of followed in our cloistered suburban Wisconsin community, where and I remember thinking that. I remember thinking when David Bowie died, I was I think he was the only representation of androgyny that I saw that wasn't persecuted, wasn't that was celebrated, and to see that again in Rocky Horror at such even a larger magnitude, especially Dan and I are essentially middle-aged. It was really refreshing, and I feel really good about it. Dan, what do you think was because you picked this movie for this episode, what was it that other than its just incredible reputation as iconic camp, what made you bite the bullet and be we got to do this?
It's curiosity more than anything. I was curious to sort of see. It is one of those things where I knew people that were into it. I kind of knew a little bit about the subculture, and it just intrigued me. I felt like I was missing out on something, especially because I think the type of people that are into this movie are usually the type of people that I'm friends with. And so it was sort of just I wanted to peek behind the curtain and see what was really going on with it all. And I do, seeing it as a 40-year-old guy, it hits so differently than it would when I was younger. Marisa, when did you first see this? What was your initial experience with it?
Yeah, so I'm 43 years old, and I first saw the film when I was 15. And I first experienced it as a film on VHS at home. It was a really difficult moment in my life because my grandmother was dying in the hospital, and my mother and I were spending every day at the hospital. And you know how heavy that can be. And one of the things that we would do to kind of decompress in the evening after these long, intense days is that we would stop at the video shop and rent something to watch that evening. And I was 14 years old. I was just beginning to really start to become interested in cult film, especially. I had grown up watching a lot of older films with my grandparents, like movie musicals from the golden era, but I hadn't yet really looked at films from, let's say, the 1960s and 70s that were kind of more art house cult classics. So this was a time in my life when I was becoming really interested in John Waters and Andy Warhol's films. And my mom remembered that she used to go with my father to our neighborhood cinema and see Rocky Horror when it first came out. So that's a few years before I was born. And my mom is actually the one who chose it. And I was just delighted and hooked from the get-go, you know, as a young bisexual teen who didn't see any representations of bisexuality in moving images at that time. That was something that was really appealing. And as silly and campy as the film is, nonetheless, there is that space to say, oh, hey, you know, this exists. There are other people like me, as ridiculous and extravagant as the context is in this film. But aside from that, just loving horror film and musicals, it's the perfect pastiche film. It's really friendly. It's funny. But the older I get, the more I realize how smart it is too. You know, when you finally have the baggage to really understand some of the film references that are embedded within the film, it's like a whole other layer of pleasure. I mean, I really often compare it to The Simpsons. It's one of those things that's super accessible and anybody can watch it and laugh and enjoy it. But there's a whole other level to kind of that you can dig up, you know, if you're familiar with certain histories and certain references.
Yeah, that's an interesting connection, especially with Homer Simpson being in Day of the Locust, of course.
Locust, yeah.
You know, that's a really, there is that element, the horror movie kind of Easter eggs and references that I think is perhaps also like, it feels strange that, you know, Dan and I have done so many horror movies for this podcast, and I never really thought about like how interconnected, like it seemed, I guess on the surface, both as I was watching the first act of the film and as, you know, I was approaching, trying to do some research on it. It seemed like just a frame, but then the more that I think about it, the more that, and I think we talk about this a little bit, maybe on some of the more like outwardly horrific camp movies like Black Swan in the, season of episodes we have, where it's like that the idea of horror, whether it's played for laughs and enjoyment or played for thrills and scares or some combination of all of that, there is this, like, there is something intrinsically campy about this idea of like horror. And then I think it almost makes me think about your phrase you used, Dan, about like peeking behind the curtain, because that's like all, like you got this normie couple of Susan Sarandon and what's the actor's name who plays
Barry Bostwick?
Thank you, Barry Bostwick. And that's essentially, you know, the frame of the story is that peeking behind the curtain, and then getting, you know, wrapped up in this. And it's very much this kind of like combination of shock and then acceptance, and then like there was so many moments in the film, for instance, such as what I assume is the very iconic scene of Frankenfurter both seducing Barry Bostwick's character and Susan Sarandon's character through silhouette, and where I was just like, yeah, this is in 1975, and like so many people went and saw this, and it still took us so long to like accept that like even bisexuality was a thing, like that I don't know. I'm a little bit rambling here just because I'm so excited to really uncover how important and pivotal this movie is in so many aspects of film history and queer history. So
yeah, and I think that scene that you mentioned is so great too, because I think that they know that they're playing into the fears of every conservative, right?
Yes.
Which is some idea about queer promiscuity, and that, you know, it's something like a contagion, and that there are absolutely, you know, they don't have any morals, and they're coming for your children. And then suddenly in this film, they just completely play into it and say, yeah, you know. But of course, it's ridiculous, and it's so ridiculous. We know that it's a parody of that.
Oh my gosh. And can we talk about Meatloaf for a second? Because I had no idea that he was going to show up as somebody who actually, like, I mean, I don't know. It made me rethink like Meatloaf's entire discography and filmography to like see, like, he's so perfect in this role that still plays a part in the gender and sexual politics of the movie, but to see that kind of like that free-flowing energy and flamboyance, and as a kid who grew up in the 90s, maybe you guys can relate a little bit, but he was seen as like, I don't know, he was like part of like the, he was doing like big ballads and all that, but he was very much like a macho masculine figure in my childhood. And then David Fincher puts him in Fight Club, and I don't know, it was incredible. I loved that song.
Yeah. Well, like Susan Sarandon too.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Like I didn't, for some reason, I had never realized she was in this movie. I had no clue. And seeing her on screen like this, it reconfigures how I view her. But I think this movie it's one of those films, kind of to what you're saying, Chris, is it makes me rethink film in general in the 1970s, and like how open it is and how confident it is. In sort of expressing something that just wasn't in everyday culture. It's really kind of an amazing work of art. And what's funny about it too, and maybe Marisa, you can talk to this a little bit. You know, it ran well in London and Los Angeles, but it sounds like it kind of hit a little bit of a bump in Broadway, where it didn't play as well. And I think it closed after, I can't remember how many performances, but it didn't seem like it was a huge hit there. And then obviously the box office, it died pretty quickly there on initial release.
Right.
Why do you think that was just sort of, specifically Broadway is interesting to me, like why it wouldn't play well there? Do you have any insight into that or any sort of thoughts about that?
I think that it just, in the United States, hadn't quite tapped into the perfect audience that the film, or excuse me, not the film, but the stage show was really targeting at that time. I think that maybe mainstream audiences for Broadway, you know, which is seen as something kind of nice to do with the family. You know, if you're an upright citizen, you can go to a Broadway show and there's nothing to, you know, cringe about that. And I think that at the time in particular, you know, Broadway shows were really representations of mainstream culture, and that this was probably getting a little bit too counterculture for that public. And I mean, even in London, you know, before it went to the West End, which is London's equivalent to Broadway, it started at a very alternative small theater. So even in London, it hadn't yet reached that kind of mainstream status. That took time. And I think that when the film was released to the Waverly audience on the midnight movie circuit, that was really going to hit a different kind of public that was ready for such a film.
I also kind of wonder if you could, because we haven't gone to a live showing, if you could kind of maybe describe the general vibe and events that take place during a live showing of this film, because I think it's really important to understand at least aspects of that to understand the overall sort of cultural significance of the movie.
Dan, before you answer that, Marisa, I'd be curious, because Dan, you were at my bachelor party, right? We went and saw The Room.
Yes, yeah.
And so like that is probably our closest reference point.
Yeah, probably The Room. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would describe it maybe as something part Halloween, part carnival. If you've ever seen representations of Brazilian carnival and everybody being festive and dressed up. So it's got the gothic Halloween aspect from the film's tone, as you know, but it's got very much the everybody party together atmosphere of carnival. So when you go to a live screening, there are people dressing up as the main characters and acting out the film in front of the screen. And this is called the shadow cast. So you've got like whole troops of people who get together and rehearse and work on their costumes to be as accurate as possible. And they rehearse together so that they can perform this sometimes on a regular basis. Like here in Paris, we've got a weekly screening on Saturday nights, and you've got different troops that rotate that have their people who act out the shadow cast. And sometimes you've got other cinemas where they might only do an annual screening at Halloween, but you do have places where it's running quite regularly on the weekends or once a month. And during the show, everybody is welcome to talk back to the screen, but there are definitely scripts these days that you can look up online because there are certain kind of talkback lines that you give during the movie. And this is linked to the mythology of like this whole interactive aspect beginning at the Waverly Theater in New York in 1976. Supposedly one audience member was so frustrated with Janet putting that flimsy little newspaper on her head when they get out of the car in the rain to Frank's castle. Somebody supposedly yelled out, "Buy an umbrella, you cheap bitch." And this is what began this interactive dialogue. But there are also really important props that we use in the film. So a lot of times different troops will hand out little goodie bags that you can use, and that's part of your admission, your ticket to the film. So you might get a little baggie with some rice in it to throw during the wedding scene. And we also hand out lots of pieces of toast, like bread toast, so that when Frankenfurter says at the dinner, just before he reveals that they're eating Eddie, he says toast, and everybody throws their slice of toast. So there are lots of fun things like that. And of course, everybody has to get up and dance the time warp as it's happening in the film. You can feel free to sing along. Now, in the old days, people would bring lighters to the cinema when they sang, there's a line that says there's a light over at the Frankenstein place. These days, I don't think that happens. I hear now that people are using their cell phones for that.
Yeah, flashlights, a little safer, right?
Yeah. So that's the participatory experience. Everyone is welcome to dress up however they want. Usually people go as characters from the film, but sometimes you just see people dressing up in ways that they think is kind of crazy or sexy or whatever. Anything goes.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
It certainly sounds like a celebration of camp.
Definitely.
In a variety of ways. And I think, looping back to sort of the season and thinking about camp in general, definitely an example of deliberate camp more than anything. And then the second category we have in the second film, and I want to transition it over to that, Day of the Locust. I selected this one as sort of naive camp. That is a film that has a sort of a serious tone that's also extravagant, but might fall short of its ambitious and lofty goals in terms of artistic merit. So I don't know. Have you guys? I had never seen this movie before, Day of the Locust. I selected it because I wanted to do Babylon, which is more recent in the last few years. But we had already selected films for the 2020s. So I was like, is there anything like this? And the Day of the Locust came up, a movie about Hollywood. Again, I had no history with this. Marisa, Chris, have you guys ever seen this one before?
No, I'd never even heard of it. So I was familiar with John Schlesinger, obviously Midnight Cowboy, Marathon Man, but even some of his later films that are not good but very enjoyable, like Pacific Heights and Falcon and the Snowman. So I was excited to watch it, and we'll get into that. But Marisa, it feels kind of, it feels like it could go either way. To bring a Rocky Horror expert and have them watch 2.5 hours of this.
Oh, well, I feel like this is one of those films that's kind of always been around, but maybe is understudied and doesn't get a lot of attention. It's a title that's I feel like is always floating around. And I had to remind myself what the film was. So I had seen it once before the podcast many years ago, and then I rewatched it for the podcast specifically. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting in comparison to Rocky Horror to look at these two very different ways of going back in time and paying tribute to old Hollywood. Now, Rocky Horror is also paying tribute to Hammer films, which are British, and other horror films, and just other titles from British history. It's not exclusively referencing American films, but it certainly does reference certain American Hollywood films. And certainly, we've got this vision of Hollywood and a kind of tribute to it, but filmed in a very different way, in a really kind of more classic way. But I think it's interesting to look at these two side by side to see just how diverse film production was in the 1970s. It's absolutely one of my favorite decades because you've got really, really innovative stuff happening in film. And at the same time, you've got more of a classic narrative film like this one, Day of the Locust. Nonetheless, I think Day of the Locust also has some creative aspects, but you really have to wait for the end. I think that ending is something that is borderline Germanist expressionist in terms of the way that the artwork is integrated into the film. And I actually love that end. I mean, a lot of people might find it really over the top compared to the kind of classic narrative structure that's been guiding us along throughout the film, but it's got interesting elements. I don't think it maybe has aged as well as Rocky Horror.
Yeah.
Maybe because it was less innovative at the time. And I can see how today we could consider a lot of things, especially the actress, what is her name? Karen
Black.
Yeah, Karen Black's performance that always strikes me as really kitschy today, even if it is kind of imitating, a certain Hollywood blonde ideal of the time.
Yeah, and I had already, one of my favorite movies of all time is Five Easy Pieces, where she plays a lot more like neo-realist role counter to Jack Nicholson. Still melodrama in many ways, but definitely nowhere near the intensity and voraciousness of this movie. And so I was excited to see how she would kind of, and I wasn't really aware that there was going to be this bifurcated structure of the film as well. Like Donald Sutherland is top billed, but we don't meet him until Act 2, and to see her as this kind of she's the main like thread that connects everything in the movie, and to see her in this kind of like whatever happened to Baby Jane makeup on the cover. I had to do interlibrary loan to track this movie down, because I refuse to rent things on Amazon because I'm insufferable. But the way in which this movie kind of came, and I'm so glad the ending wasn't ruined for me or wasn't spoiled for me in advance, was this really kind of, it was plotting. It was maybe even a little bit like tiresome, but every other scene or so, there would be something that would just like exist at the edges where I'd be like, wait, there's something else going on here. And then to have it all add up. And I think I texted Dan when it finished. I'm like, this Magnolia ass movie comes out of nowhere with an ending that's so,
oh my God. Yeah.
It's so out of the realm. And yet, even more so, actually much more so than Magnolia, I think there's so many like breadcrumbs like leading up to it. Some of the more obvious ones are like the art that William Atherton's character is creating, for his wall in his apartment, as the film goes on. And I'm curious how abrupt it felt to you guys. And going back to kind of what Marisa was talking about, and Dan, you alluded to it a little bit too, this idea of like, did it fall short? Was it just like made at the wrong time? Because it's also based on a novel from the late 30s.
Yeah, late 30s.
Right.
Where and that novel is now seen as kind of a classic of that era, but it was very much not received well at that time because it was, criticizing basically the standard Hollywood practices that were in place during that decade. And obviously the 70s in general are very much a time for like New Hollywood and like transgressing against
Mm-hmm.
the status quo and the hegemony. And yet there is something that, like you said, Marisa, has made this movie kind of lose its grandeur, its status over the years, or maybe it never really gained it at all in the first place. So where did you guys feel with both the abruptness of the ending and trying to like get some meaning out of that felt like where did it land? Because I'm still unsure about whether I think this is a good movie or a bad movie.
Right,
It's
right.
a tough one. Marisa, you go ahead.
Okay. I feel like I'm still digesting the film. I'm still thinking about it, which is a good sign, right? I mean, if you're still mulling over a film, then it's got a little something special to it. It's not instantly forgettable, right? But I like the ending. I like films personally that are really going to do an extreme change of rhythm and surprise me. I think that can be really powerful. I'm not sure if I needed the film to be 2.5 hours long. To do that. No, really. I mean, I'm not against lengthy films. Actually, I can't stand people who are anti-long films.
Yeah.
But it's got to be long for a reason. And I felt that after a while, maybe it had come to a natural stopping point. Maybe I could have done with half an hour less in terms of the rhythm of the film. I do think, in a way, it was kind of a film ahead of its time. I mean, a lot of people have said it took them so long to make this film after the novel came out. And indeed, the novel, Hollywood certainly condemned that and didn't want that to be an image of what was happening at film studios and the life of the actors and the crew members. But at the same time, I think that in the 1970s, we haven't yet quite had, I mean, we're in the midst of the sexual revolution. We're in the midst of the women's movement. And maybe the timing was just slightly off, that people were not quite ready, or that the film could have pushed certain elements a little harder in terms of like what was going on behind the scenes in the life of Karen Black's character and what Faye had to do to succeed in the movie industry. So I was thinking a lot. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the book Hollywood Babylon that Kenneth Anger wrote. Kenneth Anger being the avant-garde filmmaker who was especially active between the 50s and the 70s, but he also was really obsessed with old Hollywood, especially the silent film era. And he talks a lot about the underbelly of Hollywood at that time and really horrible things that were happening. I mean, things that we would consider today basically gang rapes that were set up at Hollywood parties, or he would talk about financial corruption in Hollywood. And he kind of unveiled all of these really gossipy, dark elements of Hollywood in his book. And I thought a lot about that while I was watching this, but I was sort of wishing that they had done it with the queer flair of Kenneth Anger, who was like totally unapologetic about being campy and over the top.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one of those films where you're not going to forget it in any sense. And it does. Have you guys, either of you, seen Babylon?
Yeah.
No.
So it's really funny because they both sort of play off the same notion of that this is what Hollywood actually is. Yes, on screen in movie theaters, it's this glitzy, glamorous, polished world. And of course, like underneath it all, there's crime, there's prostitution, there's all these horrible, awful things happening at the core of what's happening in Hollywood. I think what's tough about Day of the Locust is that the ending is really fascinating. It's super kind of over the top, extravagant, but it feels so sort of tacked on. I mean, stylistically, that is, to the first part of the film, which is slow, kind of a trudge. I kind of had wished, and this is more what Babylon is like, it's just completely over the top the entire time. I wish that Day of the Locust had that similar extravagant, over the top, expressionistic, as Marisa had said, vibe throughout the entire thing. Because then, I don't know, I feel like the messaging of the film is lost pretty significantly in the first 3/4. We're just sort of like, there's bad stuff going on. Which character am I supposed to be attached to? There's like a lot of, there has been some sort of cultural reevaluation of this film in the last like decade or so. Karen Black's obviously, you know, a very great performer in this. Donald Sutherland gets praised in this film. I don't quite understand that. I don't know if either of you can describe to me like why his performance sticks out or where it's interesting. I think William Atherton actually
he's
sticks out the most to me here. This is a guy who has played a lot of side characters in his career, and people know him from like Ghostbusters or like Real Genius. But God, I think he really captures something in this that I'd never seen him do before. So I think to me, ultimately the film falls very far short of its lofty goal, which is like the same thing with Babylon. I would never say that I like the movie Babylon, but I've watched it like 5 times.
That's like 3 hours long.
It's like, but it's one of those movies that it is, it's an ambitious failure. And I would say the same thing of Day of the Locust. I don't think it really is cohesive enough to like hit the home run or whatever. It misses, but it goes for it over and over again, where you can't deny that like it's an artistic leap, and it may fall short, but like you have to take leaps in order to do great things. It's just part of the nature of that. And so I think that's what I appreciate about this movie more than anything. It was trying to do something special and interesting and have, a very critical message about its own means of production, which is like the same thing happened with Babylon. You make a movie about Hollywood that is not the most glamorous thing, they're not going to promote it. You're not going to get any favors. It's not going to get like a lot of good press. And this one did not do super well. And obviously Babylon did not do super well. So it kind of makes sense to me that it's going to be lost in the immediate sort of reaction to it. But later on, people will sort of pick it up. And I will say there are aspects of this film that should be studied because it is a fascinating portrayal of what was happening back then. But I don't know. I don't know about you guys, but it does to me feel like it comes up a little bit short. Have any of us read the book?
No, I have it on request now at the library, which apparently I'm third in line. It's crazy that like that's how prominent the novel still is by Nathaniel West. So I was looking, as I always do, for connections between these two films, and I've got 2 things to throw at you guys. One, which maybe is a little more obvious, but in many ways, these are both horror films, right?
Yeah.
Or at least pay a good amount of kind of sideways reference to the idea, the concept of horror. And also the thing that was interesting, and I think this is true for this episode and no other ones in the season. These are the only 2 films, both directed by gay men who were out in the 70s. And I think that's significant for a number of reasons. Jim Sharman, who made Rocky Horror with the help of obviously Richard O'Brien, he has a whole memoir, apparently. I also have that now on request from the library. It's called Blood and Tinsel. I'm not sure if you've read it, Marisa, but it seems like he's got an extremely fascinating story with how he did not feel a lot of the pressures and judgment that so many others felt growing up gay in the 50s. And obviously that's, right there smack in the middle between the 30s and the 70s. And yet, and Schlesinger, kind of came like a bat out of hell. His breakthrough film was Far From the Madding Crowd, another adaptation. But then he followed that up with Midnight Cowboy, which is very overt about its gay themes and became an Oscar winner in the 60s. And here he comes back, and there is no outwardly, like you were kind of mentioning earlier, Marisa, there wasn't this like outwardly queerness in the narrative, but it does seem like this film, Day of the Locust, has amassed a lot of respect in the kind of queer film community. And there's so many elements, and I think going back to what I was saying earlier about that, like things on the edges, like the movie theater scene would not have been very interesting at all if it wasn't for the fact that there was like this thruple aspect to, the cowboy actor and Karen Black and William Atherton's back and forth, and then that's replicated later in the film with the cockfighter, and also with her own friends in the film industry, and they're kind of like reference to these. It's very lightly implied, but it seems like there was some kind of gang rape getting set up after the viewing of the Stag films in the Hollywood producers' homes, which, by the way, is another aspect. This concept of like rich elites getting together to watch Stag films that I didn't even know about until we watched Pearl for the opening episode of this season, and it's amazing how there's all this stuff going back to, once again, the common theme here is the peek behind the curtain. And I feel like if we were going to tie this back, I always try to come back to Sontag's essay or her collection of notes on camp. And there's two interesting pieces one about Rocky Horror and how it relates to Sontag's famous introduction of the concept, and one that relates to Dave the Locust. And the thing that seems to be delineating them both is that while Rocky Horror, in that deliberate way, is very much celebrating the androgyne, and there's this quote where she says, refers to this idea of, quote, fully developed camp, to convert one thing into something else.
Right.
The lighting fixtures in the form of flowering plants, the living room, which is really a grotto, which very much feels like this encapsulation of what Rocky Horror does for both people on either side of Frankenfurter's door. And then for Day of the Locust, there's this element of Sontag's discussion about Leni Riefenstahl, not to bring Nazism into it, but that is very much like this, quote, she refers to it as like this fascist aesthetic, and brings up everything from like Walt Disney's Fantasia to also like Busby Berkeley's musicals from the 40s and 30s. And there's this really strong element of that in Day of the Locust. And, right there in the title, similar to Magnolia, is this, it feels like this big questioning, this big attack, this big kind of attempt to tear down and uncover the rampant fascism of early Hollywood. And I think you're right, Marisa. I don't think people were ready for it at the time. So now I'm just like talking through all this. I think I'm going to go with I'm a Day of the Locust defender. I think it's great.
But I'm so glad that you brought up the political aspects, and especially the references to fascism, which I think are really important actually in both films, but they are quietly there under the surface. I mean, there is, of course, the fascism in general of society, which I think that Rocky Horror is tackling. And this is also the fascism of Hollywood that's tackled, head on in Day of the Locust. But it's also, there are subtle references to the Second World War in both films.
True.
We see Hitler's rise to power. There's a scene in Day of the Locust when the main characters all go to watch a movie, and they're showing the newsreels after the film, and they're leaving. But as they're leaving the theater, they turn their back to the newsreel, and we see Hitler's rise to power. And I'm thinking that this is actual footage from a Riefenstahl film, Triumph of the Will. I'd have to watch it again to double check that, but it looks like it. And then in Rocky Horror, you've got subtle references to the war as well. That the character Frankenfurter wears a pink, or some people argue a red triangle, pink being the identifying symbol for homosexuals, and red being the red triangle being the symbol for political prisoners. So you've got references throughout that are interwoven, and I think that political aspect is something that really unites both of the films as well.
Interesting. Wow. I didn't even catch the triangle piece. Thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely.
One thing I have to talk about, Day of the Locust. So one thing that's like, I have to go back to it. I won't talk about the cockfighting scene, which they got in trouble for, by the way.
Oh, was it actual chickens?
I think it was.
They just let them fight.
Don't tell me.
Oh god.
The sexual assault scene.
Oh my god.
Now, like it, I don't know what to make of it, because it is very disturbing how it's done. So I guess artistically, that's significant and important. something that popped into my head, and I'm just going to say this because it's the thing that like stood out to me when I was watching the movie. There is this sort of in Day of the Locust specifically, and very much contrasting to Rocky Horror. It felt like there is this very paternal, sort of patriarchal viewpoint that was coming across in Day of the Locust that might have been part of the novel. It's this sort of the world's falling apart because things are, culture's becoming mutable and changing. And it's this, I don't know, maybe this is something that I'm bringing to it, but I read it as a very conservative viewpoint of the world. Whereas Rocky Horror is completely the opposite. It's very open. Everything is happening. It's okay. Everything's happening. It's okay. Things are different. It's okay that we see things differently and act differently. Whereas Day of the Locust has this sort of, I'm going to say this, almost like a Fox News view of the world, where it's like, hey, there's this moral standard that exists somewhere out there. I don't know where it exists, but it exists and it's real. And if we transgress against it, then the whole world's going to fall apart. That's one of the vibes that I get from Day of the Locust. And I don't know if that's me reading too much into it, but it has that sort of old white dude vibe to it. Get off my lawn type sort of ideology. Do you guys see that at all? Or is that completely blowing that out of thin air?
Do you think that's a case of like illustrating the status quo to bring it to our attention? Or do you really think that the film is reinforcing that?
I fall more into the reinforcing.
Really? I feel like this is a common theme between Dan and I.
Yeah, we tend to have this.
Depiction and endorsement.
What have I fallen into?
We can talk about Goodfellas if you want, Chris. But I think that's the thing. There's an element of it there where it's shown on screen. Is this critical? Is it satire? Is it subverting that? Mm-hmm. And I just, for me, there wasn't enough there of an undertow to really undermine that grandiosity of like the decline of the West or something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it just kind of felt that way to me throughout the entire film, especially with the ending. But I don't know. What do you guys think?
This is related, but it's not exactly the same thing. From me, I took away a message of how good people are easily roped into doing bad things. And for me, there's the reminder of that, of course, with the reference to Hitler in the background. But then this final scene when Donald Sutherland's character absolutely snaps and he just stomps on the child and murders the child. But he's all along been the nicest, truest, sincerest guy in the film. And then suddenly he snaps. And, there are certain things we can point to in the film to indicate how he arrived at this point. But in the end, we're not really sure. And we're not really sure who has the capacity to resort to that level of violence. But to me, it feels like a reminder of how very ordinary, very sympathetic people can be driven to this level of intense, murderous violence. So that's something that I thought about in the film. I'm still thinking about your approach to the film.
Yeah, no, and I'd have to agree that, if you had titled the movie like, Hollywood Dreams or something, and then cut off the last half hour of it, then yeah, of course, I think you'd have something there, Dan. But I think this is also a stylistic preference. But I think there is something, dare I say it, even more transgressive about like trying to reel the viewer in with an attempt at depicting what makes these characters drawn to the dream of Hollywood, only to have it torn down by literal like blood and murder and rage. It almost seems like perhaps you could make the argument it's too on the nose. This is like shoving it down the throat of the unsuspecting watcher, and yet I still think that there's something valuable in that, in the manipulative kind of tendency that's just like embedded in the medium of film, that we are supposed to be entranced, because that's William Atherton was entranced. Karen Black's character was entranced.
Yeah, that's true.
And so to have that like happen to you, the viewer, only makes that more powerful. Like, yes, I was shocked by the ending, but then I read the title of I look at the title on the cover of the DVD, and I'm just like, well, I'm an idiot for thinking it would end any other way.
Yeah, like, it points where it's going.
Yeah.
Often.
But do you guys think that in both cases, in both films, and to different extents, there's also this questioning of what's really happening? I mean, they're both films about film. So they've got this meta idea about dreams, Hollywood dreams, about what reality is and what's actually happening. The tagline of Rocky Horror is "Don't dream it, be it." But by the end, when the castle lifts off and it's no longer there, we're left to wonder, did that really happen? Who would believe them? And in a sense, we've got people who are so wrapped up in the life of Hollywood film studios and Day of the Locust that I'm starting to wonder, how much of their life is influenced by their work in the film industry to the extent that they can't turn it off when they get home at night. And how is all of that playing into our perception of these films?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because I think that it speaks back to kind of why perhaps Dan and I, if I was really going to self-interrogate, took so long to get to Rocky Horror. I think, as liberal as, we were in our young rebellious age, and as, left-minded we continue to become through college and adulthood, there is this kind of still like break. I think there is this boundary that perhaps was more subconscious than either of us would like to admit, that kept us from Rocky Horror and its, really celebratory queerness, that I think is just as important as the inverse, which is maybe arguably easier to swallow. The idea that, the world in which we were brought up in, the concept of the American dream. Karen Black was also in the one of the 70s adaptation of The Great Gatsby, right? Which is just kind of like another take on the Day of the Locust story.
Yeah, exactly.
In a way. That feels like a first step. Rocky Horror is the second step. And
yeah, that's a really good point.
I think
Day of the Locust is like the gateway,
right?
And like Rocky Horror is like the next step.
Yeah. So we're radicalized now. So thank you, Marisa.
I'm glad you're radicalized. And I do think, of course, the queer culture is so essential in Rocky Horror, but I just wouldn't want us to forget too how much of a film lover's film it really is.
Totally.
There are so many film titles to dig into, and you had mentioned, Busby Berkeley earlier, and of course, there's a parody of a water ballet from a Busby Berkeley musical at the end of Rocky Horror, and it's just full of little tidbits like that are a delight for film lovers.
Awesome. Well, can we close out the show with some trivia?
Yes, trivia.
If you'd okay. I believe I forgot to prep you, Marisa.
Don't worry, I'm terrible at them.
You will.
Okay, I'm terrible at trivia as well.
We're race to the bottom.
It's pretty simple how this works for our episodes on camp cinema. We're looking at other camp or campy films from the 1970s, and I'm just going to read you some very campy quotes from the film and see who guesses it first. Okay?
Okay.
So other campy films from the 1970s. Let's start, as I attempt to, always, with an easy one. And I'll give my co-host the hint that we covered this film on a previous episode in a previous season. Okay? At one time I used to break into pet shops to liberate the canaries, but I decided that was an idea way before its time. Zoos are full, prisons are overflowing. Oh my, how the world still dearly loves a cage. Feel free to jump in, Marisa, if you know it.
I'm so bad at this.
This isn't One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, is it?
No, that would be thematically appropriate, of course, but no.
70s, huh?
Sounds distantly familiar, but I'm terrible at this.
Nope. Good guess also.
Straight Time?
No, you are going more with like the masculine guesses.
Is
Let's
it
try this one.
aliens?
Yeah, keep going.
There seems to be a definite pattern emerging, and of course this pattern, once isolated, can be coped with. Recognize the problem and you're halfway on the road to its solution. Tell me, what do you do for fun? What activity gives you a certain sense of enjoyment, different from the others? And then the response by one of the titular characters is, I go to funerals.
Oh,
Harold
Harold and Maude.
There you go.
Yeah, we'll do a joint. That's a joint win.
Joint win.
Yeah.
Nice one. Yeah, I feel like you could do a whole other episode. We looked at that with the lens of risque romance,
Oh,
and
fantastic.
obviously the age gap discourse came up first and foremost. But there's also just like such a campy element to that film and its characters and its
Drunken
dialogue.
heads.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, here's another one, maybe a little more difficult, but I'll add the clue that it was actually already mentioned on this episode. So here is a famous quote from it. Now I got to scroll down and find it. Where did it go? Maybe it's at the top. Here we go. This is a classic interchange of dialogue. One character says, "Do you believe in God?" And the other character says, "I am God."
1970s campy.
That one is, while it's a famous part of the film, it's not a lot to work with. Let me give you a quote from the narrator. The filthiest people alive? Well, you think you know someone filthier?
Pink flamingos.
There you go. Nice work, Marisa.
Good job.
Yeah, and we, as when this episode is released, we will have just discussed the 80s version of Hairspray.
Ooh,
so it'll
fantastic.
be, yeah, that's a fun one too. Okay, here's my personal favorite, a film I grew up with, and maybe you did too, Dan. I'm not sure how much TBS you watched. I'll shove that bat up your ass and turn you into a popsicle. I'd imagine it was cut from the edited TBS version.
Attack of Killer Tomatoes?
Oh, good one. No.
No.
How about...
Yeah, what's the next one? What do you
Okay,
got?
so this is... there's a radio DJ in this film, and the character says, "Good news, boppers. The big alert has been called off. It turns out that the early reports were wrong, all wrong. Now for that group out there that had such a hard time getting home, sorry about that. I guess the only thing we can do is play you a song."
That sounds really familiar.
Yeah, same. Oh, so familiar.
I don't know, man. Keep going. What do you got? Give me some clues.
Okay, I've in an attempt to not say the name of the film, I'll say the second part of this quote. And this should just lock it in, I'd hope. Otherwise, I'm going to be very disappointed in both of you.
Ooh.
So, name of the film. Come out to play.
Oh, Warriors.
There we go.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
That's a good one. It's classic.
Yeah. Once again, that's a movie that I probably would not have even thought could be construed as campy when I was younger.
Really?
You look back. Well, like as a teenager, you're like, oh yeah, this is just like a fun game.
I don't know. It's pretty over the top, Chris.
I know. The baseball
It says a lot
uniforms.
about you, I'll tell you that.
It does. It does. Okay. Next we have... I'll end with a more fun one. So this is the penultimate quote. Character says, "She was living in a single room with 3 other individuals. One of them was a male, and the other two were females. God only knows what they were up to in there. And furthermore, Susan, I wouldn't be the least bit surprised to learn that all 4 of them habitually smoked marijuana cigarettes. Reefers."
I don't know.
It's not Reefer Madness.
Nope.
Yeah, it's a little too late
It would be
for
a little
for
too
that.
obvious. Yeah. How about This one is perhaps known more for its visuals than its dialogue, but let's try this. Oh God, yeah, this is an awful quote, and I can't believe I'm saying it out loud, but here I go. You will drink the black sperm of my vengeance. Okay, I'll just give you the clue that will just nail it on its head. Screenplay was co-written by Roger Ebert.
By the Dolls?
Yeah.
Wow.
Beyond the Valley of the Dolls.
Beyond the Valley of the Dolls,
love
sorry,
it.
yeah.
Right. Rated X, 1970. Oh my gosh.
Roger.
Yeah. I hope he didn't write that line.
I've never seen it, though. I got to see it.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's one from my adolescence. God,
It's a
so good.
trip. Not in a great way. Okay, last but not least, oh my God, there's so many good ones for this one. I'm gonna go with beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain. Is that the kind of beautiful you mean? Is it? I'm afraid this is hardly a criticism. I've got an easier one. Okay, all right. Try the second one. This one, I'm not sure.
I love that. People that are listening to this are like, "Oh, I know this right away."
Yeah,
come on, guys.
We weren't lying when we said we were bad.
Yeah.
We preface this with we're both terrible.
He promised, and I believed him, but sin never dies. Sin never dies. At first it was all right, and we lived sinlessly. We slept in the same bed, but we never did it. And then that night I saw him looking down at me that way. We got down on our knees to pray for strength. I smelled the whiskey on his breath. Then he took me. He took me with the stink of filthy roadhouse whiskey on his breath, and I liked it. I liked it. With all that dirty touching of his hands all over me, I should have given you to God when you were born, but I was weak and backsliding, and now the devil has come. We'll pray.
Yikes.
Oh, this is so
great
good.
line reading, by the way.
Oh, it's from Carrie. Carrie.
Yeah, nice work,
Nice. Good job.
Brian De Palma's.
Oh God, I haven't seen that forever.
Oh yeah, I'm excited. I'm going to teach that one next week.
Oh,
nice.
For our 1970s unit at school.
The public school, they're allowing you to teach them? Crazy.
The parents signed the permission slip, so out of my hands.
Love that for you guys.
Oh, times they are changing.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Marisa, for joining us. This has been a pleasure. And
I've
learned so much.
Oh, I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much to both of you for having me.
Of course. And then what do we got coming up, Chris?
1960s. We're going to get into Umbrellas of Cherbourg, which you've never seen, correct?
I've never seen.
I'm excited.
Yeah,
that'll be a fun one.
Awesome. Thanks for listening. This has been Film Trace.